This is a secure naval installation, not a graduate school library, ma'am. Your clearance is irrelevant if you can't even follow a simple dress code." The words, dripping with condescension, echoed across the polished concrete floor of the Cyber Warfare Operations Center. The crowd of uniformed officers and enlisted personnel flinched, then a few snickered into their hands. They all turned to look at the source of Admiral Marcus Vance's fury, a small, unassuming woman in faded jeans, a simple gray sweater, and worn-out sneakers. She didn't react. Her focus remained entirely on the laptop open in front of her, its screen a cascade of incomprehensible code. Her posture was one of deep concentration, a stillness that seemed to absorb the Admiral's anger and render it inert. But when the attack klaxons began to scream their piercing, digital wail, and the Admiral's own experts looked to him with panic in their eyes, he would remember that silence not as weakness, but as the calm at the very center of a hurricane. He would remember the moment he dismissed the most powerful weapon in the arsenal. If you believe that true authority is proven through action, not proclaimed with a loud voice, type competence below. The woman, Dr. Eris Thorne, didn't even blink. Her fingers, long and nimble, continued their silent dance across the keyboard, not with the frantic pecking of a stressed technician, but with the deliberate, flowing grace of a concert pianist. She was an island of calm in a sea of rising panic, a study in focused competence that was utterly lost on the man who outranked everyone in the room. Admiral Vance saw only defiance. He saw a civilian contractor who had been flown in on an emergency authorization, a supposed expert who showed up looking like she was ready for a weekend trip to the farmer's market, not to defend the nation's most critical maritime infrastructure. His entire career was built on the bedrock of order, discipline, and the clear visual language of rank. Her appearance was an insult to that entire system. Admiral Vance took another step closer, his polished shoes clicking with aggressive finality. He was a man accustomed to immediate obedience, his voice a tool honed over decades to command destroyers and carrier groups. To have it so thoroughly ignored by this academic was a personal affront. "Did you hear me?" he boomed, his voice now a low growl that made a young ensign nearby physically recoil. "I don't care if your paperwork was signed by the Secretary of Defense himself. On my watch, in my command center, you will adhere to protocol. This is a sterile environment, both in terms of security and professionalism. Your presence here is a contamination." He gestured dismissively at her attire, then at her entire being. The onlookers shifted, their amusement turning to nervous apprehension. They knew the Admiral's temper. They also knew that the network anomalies they had been tracking for the past 6 hours had just cascaded into a full-blown system-wide assault. But Vance was too caught up in the theater of his own authority to see the growing fear on the faces of his own team. He saw only a nail that was sticking up, and his only tool was a hammer. He turned to a pair of Marine security guards standing by the main entrance. "Sergeant, escort this woman to the main gate. Her temporary access is revoked. See to it that she is off my base within the next 10 minutes." The sergeant, a young man with duty etched into his jawline, snapped to attention. "Aye, Admiral." He and his partner began to walk toward Dr. Thorne, their expressions grim. Thorne finally stopped typing. She slowly closed the lid of her laptop, the soft click seeming impossibly loud in the tense room. She didn't look at the Admiral. She didn't look at the approaching Marines. She simply stood, a ghost of a sigh escaping her lips, and prepared to leave. She had seen this before. The arrogance, the assumptions, the brittle pride of men who confused the symbols of power with power itself. The moment the Marine sergeant placed a hesitant hand on her shoulder to guide her away, all hell broke loose. It wasn't a gradual failure, it was a catastrophic collapse. The main tactical display behind the Admiral, a massive, wall-sized screen showing the status of the entire Atlantic Fleet's digital network, flickered violently. Green status icons representing secure communications links, drone feeds, and weapons systems began winking out, replaced by crimson skulls, the universal icon of a hostile system takeover. A synthesized voice, cold and devoid of emotion, began to chant from the overhead speakers, "System compromised. Firewall breached. Paladin protocol. Failed." The last word hung in the air like a death sentence. Paladin was their shield, the multi-billion-dollar cyber defense network that was supposed to be impenetrable. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Technicians shouted jargon-filled reports that all amounted to the same thing. They were blind, deaf, and defenseless. "Sir, we've lost control of the Aegis targeting systems on the USS Jefferson," one officer cried out, his voice cracking. "The primary satellite uplink is down. We're completely isolated," another yelled. Admiral Vance spun around, his face ashen. The carefully constructed world of order and protocol he so fiercely defended had just disintegrated into digital dust. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark terror of a commander who had lost his fleet without a single shot being fired. In that moment of pure panic, as his best and brightest stared helplessly at their dark screens, Dr. Eris Thorne did something extraordinary. She simply stopped walking. She turned, not to the Admiral, but to the nearest unoccupied terminal, her movements fluid and economical. The Marine sergeant who was escorting her paused, confused. "Ma'am, we have to go." She ignored him completely. Her eyes were scanning the dying network, but she wasn't seeing the chaos. She was seeing the pattern behind it, the ghost in the machine. Her hands moved with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. It wasn't typing. It was a form of communication with the machine, a direct interface between her mind and the cascading logic of the system. While the Admiral's team had been fighting the symptoms, trying to patch breaches and rebuild firewalls, she was going for the source. She didn't fight the virus, she wrote it. She used the attacker's own intrusion pathways as a roadmap, weaving through their digital traps and backdoors with an innate understanding of their architecture. The code that filled her screen was not defensive. It was aggressive, predatory. She was hunting. The Admiral, drawn by the sudden, focused silence in one corner of his chaotic command center, watched her, his mind struggling to reconcile the disheveled academic with the surgical precision he was witnessing. He had seen elite fighter pilots in a high G turn with this level of focus. He had seen SEALs breach a room with this kind of lethal efficiency. He had never seen it expressed through a keyboard. The room full of panicked shouting slowly quieted as, one by one, every person turned to watch her. They didn't understand what she was doing, but they understood they were in the presence of a master. She wasn't just countering the attack, she was dissecting it, mapping its nervous system in real time. Then, after 90 seconds of sustained, impossibly fast work, she stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a single, pregnant pause. She typed one final command line, short, elegant, and brutally simple, and pressed enter. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A deafening silence fell over the command center as every alarm cut off at once. On the main tactical display, the thousands of crimson skulls vanished, not replaced by green, but by a single, stark white screen. Then, a map of the world materialized. A red circle blinked into existence over a remote, mountainous region in Eastern Europe, accompanied by precise geographic coordinates and a live satellite image of a nondescript warehouse. At the bottom of the screen, a single line of text appeared in plain, block letters. Threat neutralized. Source acquired. Counter-assault ready. The silence that followed was more profound than the noise it replaced. It was a silence born of shock and awe. The technicians and officers stared, mouths agape, at the screen. They hadn't just been saved. They had witnessed a miracle. They had spent hours fighting a losing battle, only to watch this quiet, dismissed woman win the entire war in under 2 minutes. Admiral Vance stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief, humiliation, and a dawning, terrifying understanding. The foundation of his worldview, that appearance, discipline, and protocol were the cornerstones of competence, had not just been cracked, it had been pulverized into dust. His authority, which he had wielded like a weapon just moments before, now felt like a child's toy. He had been so obsessed with the cover of the book that he had ordered the author thrown out of the library. It was in this frozen tableau of stunned silence that the heavy blast doors at the rear of the command center hissed open. It wasn't the base commander or a relief crew. It was a team of 4 men in dark suits and earpieces, their movements sharp, their eyes scanning every corner of the room with an unnerving intensity. Secret Service. The room's occupants, already in shock, seemed to shrink in on themselves. The agents formed a protective diamond, and through it walked the President of the United States. He wore a grim, determined expression, his stride purposeful. He didn't acknowledge the salutes that snapped up around the room. He didn't even glance at the petrified Admiral Vance. His eyes scanned the room for only one person. He walked directly to Dr. Eris Thorne, who was still standing calmly at the terminal. He came to a stop beside her, his gaze fixed not on the world map she had conjured, but on her. "Eris," he said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Report." Dr. Thorne finally turned her head, her expression as placid as ever. There was no triumph in her eyes. No, "I told you so." There was only the calm, detached focus of a professional who had completed a task. "Threat neutralized, Mr. President," she stated, her voice quiet but clear. The attackers used a quantum-encrypted polymorphic virus, but they routed their command and control through a single legacy server in the Balkans. It was a sloppy oversight. "I've isolated their C2 node and geolocated the hardware. We have a 5-minute window to deploy the counter payload before they can initiate a remote data wipe and scrub their physical drives." Her report was a masterpiece of efficiency, devoid of emotion or ego. It was the pure, unvarnished data of the situation. The President nodded once, a gesture of complete trust and understanding. He turned to a military aide who had followed him in. "Signal Sentinel Command. Green light, Operation Nightfall. Full payload." The aide nodded and spoke quietly into his wrist communicator. The order was given. The counterstrike was on its way. Only then, with the crisis handled and the nation's defense secured, did the President turn his attention to the Admiral. His gaze was cold steel. "Admiral Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne. Let me be perfectly clear. She doesn't work for you. She doesn't work for the Department of the Navy. She works for me. She is the lead architect of the entire Paladin defense network your men were just trying and failing to operate. When we have a problem that a 4-star admiral and his entire command cannot handle, we call her. Her call sign is Ghost, and 15 minutes ago, you ordered her off my base." The emphasis on "my" was a deliberate, surgical strike, reminding the admiral who was truly in command. The name Ghost hung in the air, and for the handful of senior intelligence officers in the room, it landed like a thunderclap. It was a name that wasn't supposed to be spoken. It was a legend, a myth whispered about in the highest echelons of national security. Ghost wasn't a person, it was a concept, a final resort. The shadowy figure who had designed the nation's most secret and sensitive digital weapons and defenses, a civilian so critical that her identity was classified above top secret. They said Ghost could break any code, breach any system, and build firewalls that were decades ahead of their time. They never imagined Ghost was the quiet woman in the gray sweater. The story of what happened in the Cyber Warfare Operations Center that day did not spread through official channels or after-action reports. It spread the way all true legends do, in whispers. It moved like wildfire through the barracks, across the mess halls, and over encrypted communication channels. The young Marine sergeant who had been ordered to escort her out told his fire team, his voice filled with a reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. The panicked ensign who had watched the network collapse told his bunkmates about the woman who rebuilt it in 90 seconds. The story was retold and embellished, but its core elements remained the same. The arrogant admiral, the quiet woman, the impossible feat, and the President's stunning arrival. She became known simply as Ghost, a living legend on a base where she no longer physically existed. The name became a symbol, a new piece of naval folklore representing the triumph of pure, unadorned competence over the empty posturing of rank. Junior officers and enlisted coders started using the phrase, "pulling a ghost," to describe an elegant, unexpectedly simple solution to a complex problem. The myth of Dr. Eris Thorne became more powerful than any commendation or medal because it was a story about them, about the undervalued, the overlooked, the quiet professionals whose true worth was often invisible to the hierarchy above them. Her legend gave them hope. It was a potent reminder that the most important person in the room might not be the one with the most stripes on their sleeve, but the one with the quietest voice and the sharpest mind. It was a fundamental shift in the culture, a small crack in the rigid edifice of military tradition, planted by a woman who asked for nothing and, in doing so, earned everything. For Admiral Marcus Vance, the aftermath was a quiet, personal hell. He wasn't publicly reprimanded or demoted. The president knew that such an action would only draw unwanted attention to the incident and to Dr. Thorne. Instead, Vance was left with something far worse: his own irrelevance. His authority, once absolute, was now a hollow shell. He would walk into a room, and the respectful silence that followed would be laced with a new, unspoken knowledge. His subordinates still called him sir, but their eyes held a different light. They had seen the man behind the uniform, and they had seen him be utterly and completely wrong. The humiliation was a slow-acting poison. One afternoon, weeks later, Vance was walking through a software development lab on base. He saw a young petty officer, a woman no older than his own daughter, struggling with a piece of diagnostic code, her brow furrowed in frustration. The old Vance would have walked past without a second thought, or perhaps offered a condescending remark about her abilities. But this was a new man, a humbled man. He stopped, stood beside her for a long moment, and then spoke, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "What's the problem, petty officer?" She explained the issue, expecting a lecture. Instead, the Admiral listened patiently. He didn't have the answer, and he knew it. "Who on your team sees things differently than everyone else?" he asked. The question surprised her. "That would be Seaman Miller, sir. He's kind of quiet, a bit odd, but he always finds a weird angle." The Admiral nodded slowly. "Go ask him," he said, "and listen to what he has to say." It was a small gesture, but it was the beginning of a profound transformation. He was learning, painfully and slowly, to look past the uniform and search for the competence hidden within. As for Dr. Thorne, she was gone. She had left with the president, disappearing as quietly as she had arrived. There was no ceremony, no thank you. For her, the reward was not the recognition. The reward was the solved problem, the restored order, the silent hum of a secure system. The work was its own validation. Months later, the legacy of that day began to solidify into official doctrine. A new training module was introduced at the Naval War College for all aspiring Cyber Command officers. It was an ethics and personnel management course, and it was unofficially nicknamed the Ghost Protocol. The core of the curriculum was a single, anonymized case study detailing a catastrophic network failure and its unconventional resolution. It taught future leaders to actively seek out and empower dissonant, non-traditional thinkers. It trained them to recognize that genius often wore camouflage, and that the most common camouflage was an unassuming appearance. The lesson was simple and direct. Do not make Admiral Vance's mistake. Assumptions are a commander's greatest vulnerability. The terminal that Dr. Thorne had used in the operations center was quietly taken offline. It was not sent to storage or repurposed. It was left in place, a silent monument. The junior officers, on their own initiative, affixed a small, brass plaque to the side of the monitor. It read, "Reserved." Everyone knew what it meant. It was the Ghost's desk. New technicians assigned to the command center were always told the story on their first day. It was a rite of passage, a foundational myth of their new world. "That's where she did it," a grizzled Master Chief would say, pointing to the dark screen. "Remember, your job is to listen to the machines, but your duty is to listen to the people, all of them. You never know when the quietest person in the room is the only one who can save it." The story became a bulwark against the kind of institutional arrogance that had almost cost them everything, a constant, living reminder that true strength often makes no sound at all until it is desperately needed. The tale of Dr. Eris Thorne became more than just a story. It became a principle. It was a testament to the idea that in the complex, interconnected world of modern warfare, the most valuable assets are not always the loudest, the strongest, or the most decorated. They are the thinkers, the architects, the quiet professionals who operate in the silent spaces between the ones and zeros. They are the ones who build the shields, forge the weapons, and see the patterns that others miss. Their legacy is not etched onto monuments or read aloud at ceremonies. It is written in lines of elegant code, in the silent hum of secure servers, and in the continued safety of a nation that will never know their names. The real lesson that echoed from that day was one of profound and lasting importance. Respect is not a function of a uniform or a title. It is a debt owed to competence, and it is a debt that must be paid, whether to a four-star admiral or a quiet woman in a gray sweater. True legacy isn't what you proclaim in the light. It's what you build in the shadows, what continues to function perfectly long after you have moved on to the next problem. It is the enduring strength of the systems designed to protect us, upheld by the invisible heroes we so often fail to see. The world is safe not because of the loud pronouncements of the powerful, but because of the silent, relentless dedication of the brilliant. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent precision defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.